Hi, I am live from Pelham's Wasteland, and I am back with another episode of Pelham's Wasteland Reads, um, which this time is going to be sort of an overview for 2024, I guess, of some of my favorite things that I've read over the course of the year. Um, I checked Goodreads, and apparently I've read 123 books this year, which is pretty good. My normal reading goal is 100 pages a day on average. Basically, that's the way that I think about it, because I at one point was measuring based on like books read for the year, and I felt like that encouraged reading shorter books, and I was like, ah, well, why not do it this way? Um, anyway, that's just sort of, I guess, about me. But I thought I would talk about a couple of my favorites. I picked out a list of 10 favorites from the year. Um, some of them are standalone books, some of them I have grouped series together to talk about kind of the whole series as one entity, because that's just sort of what makes sense to me, I guess. I didn't necessarily try to target 10, but I felt like that's a good number and doesn't go on forever. Um, I have a couple of things that I reread also on here, so I guess we'll talk about that. I at one point was thinking, well, that doesn't, I already knew that I liked those books because I was rereading them because I liked them. Um, but I also sort of, I guess, feel like I haven't talked about those books on here at all, and they are favorites of mine that I want to talk about. So that's always fun. I guess the last thing I'll mention is that I realized just before starting to record this that the list I came up with is all fiction books, which I guess one of them is sort of nonfiction, um, which I didn't necessarily intend. And I read some good nonfiction books over the year, and I'll probably talk a little bit about one or two of them because they're sort of relevant to um, other books on this list. But I don't know, maybe in the future I'll do like a specific fiction, nonfiction sections so that some more nonfiction books can make it into the list. I don't know. Who knows? I'm, totally making it up as I go along. But anyway, and then I'm just going to put everything in sort of chronological order of when I read them. So, yeah, let's start with the first book, which is The Glass Bees by Ernst Junger, who is a controversial figure, to put it mildly. He enlisted in the German army in World War One, had to lie about his age to get in, and then after that wrote a book called Storm of Steel, which is a memoir of the First World War, that is really good, and I read it many years ago now, and was sort of blown away by it. But then afterwards, he also wrote other things, uh, and has the kind of dubious distinction of also being a favorite of the Nazis in the Second World War, despite not actually being a member of the party. It's a whole complicated thing, and I don't, it's one of those difficult things that I think it's easy for apologists to suggest a distinction that people who are not interested in looking for a distinction there might not feel is as relevant. And so I don't know. It's a weird thing, and of course is something that a whole lot of people had to deal with over the course of that period. But anyway, the Glass Bees, I don't remember if I'm pretty sure it's from after the war. Um, he has another one on the Marble Cliffs that is a favorite of mine that was published in 1938 in Munich and is like basically an allegory for the rise of fascism, which is pretty wild. But the Glass Bees, like I said, I'm pretty sure it's from after the war and is a kind of a strange dystopian story about technology and paranoia and a very rapidly changing culture in the face of that technology. Um, the story follows a sort of a man looking for work, basically, who is conversing with a potential employer who is this kind of brilliant inventor who has totally reshaped the culture of this civilization, this kind of vaguely post-war civilization. Um, and then the glass bees are this kind of specific element of the technological reshaping that is happening over the course of the book. It's sort of hard to get too much into what happens in the book because a lot of what the book is about isn't sort of just what happens, but how all these characters are kind of reacting to all the things going on and their sort of sense of isolation and paranoia, like I said. While also, I mean, as much as the book is very much about a kind of a culture, a civilization that is undergoing pretty significant change because of technological developments, it is also in some ways about the ways that even when things change, they stay the same um, in some very particular ways. So anyway, Glass Bees, really good, totally worth checking out if that sounds interesting to you, that kind of strange, specific sort of dystopian flavored thing, I guess. All right, next one is The Tournament by Peter Vansittart. I have now, this is the second Vansittart that I've read because I read The Wall last year, which was also really good. They're both very kind of historical fiction, but historical fiction that emphasizes kind of the strangeness of history rather than the similarity, if that makes sense. They're very much about this kind of particular flavor of the period that they take place in. Um, the Wall being about the Roman Emperor Aurelian and the city of Rome and building the Aurelian walls. And then the tournament being about the Duchy of Burgundy, if I remember. Um, this kind of late medieval kingdom in, I guess not technically a kingdom, but a late medieval state in decline. Um, and the kind of strangeness going on there, not anything like a fantastical strangeness, but just the attempt to kind of bring the flavor of how people lived and thought about the world into modernity in a way that really emphasizes um, the sort of uniqueness of the period and all that sort of stuff. Um, and again, this is kind of like with the Glass Bees. I think this is one where there is definitely a plot. There's a plague at one point that happens. There's the titular tournament that happens. There's definitely things that happen and characters who make things happen in the world. But as much as anything, this is a book that is really about the kind of texture of this world, this very kind of particular flavor of late medieval Northern Europe, and this kind of yeah, the sort of strange constellation of characters involved in that, and their um, the way that I guess, like I said, the way that there is a really kind of particular quality to what life is like for all these people that is kind of recognizably still part of the kind of tapestry of human experience, but also has a kind of unique distinctions mixed in with it. So anyway, I really like. I've enjoyed these Vansittart books a lot. I have one or two others on the shelf that I will probably read. They're also all of these have been really short, um, so totally worth checking out if that sounds interesting to you. All right, and now we are getting into some books that are a little more widely read, I guess. Certainly more popular, I think is fair to say. Gene Wolfe is one of my favorite authors. I've enjoyed so much of his stuff. Although there's some stuff of his that I've read that I've been like, it's okay. But that's okay too. You know, it's all right. You don't have to write every book as like a total hit. Um, but you know, the Book of the New Sun in particular is such a thing that has stuck with me over the years, I guess is the way to put it. And this one I suspect will stick with me over the years as well. The Wizard Knight is the sort of term for the series as a whole. The first book is the Knight, and the second book is the Wizard. It's dedicated to Yves Menard of the Book of Nights fame, which is also a book that I really love. At least the first one is dedicated to him, if I remember correctly. Maybe they're both, maybe just the second one. I don't remember exactly, I guess. But the Book of Nights also worth checking out if you enjoy this kind of strange, fantastical thing. The story follows a young man. I guess he's a boy in our world, but there's a sort of portal fantasy element where he ends up in this um, fantastical world, this fantasy land that sort of has echoes of Arthurian mythology and also of kind of Norse mythology in a number of places, and all of these other kind of different things. There's a whole kind of fairyland element as well, and this kind of Norse mythology style layers of worlds that are all connected, but that is also sort of like a kind of like a Neoplatonist idea of like the way that the music of the spheres creates this kind of layers of existence almost, and it's really kind of fascinating and fun, and of course told in all of Gene Wolfe's kind of signature ways that are really fun to dig into. Anyway, so our protagonist Abel ends up becoming a knight and is doing his best to be a good knight and doesn't always succeed, but you know is still doing his best as he's trying to uphold the ideals of knighthood and also to do all these kind of strange and fantastical things. Um, which is yeah, like I said, I don't know, it's Gene Wolfe. All of almost all of his stuff is worth reading, even the stuff that I don't think is necessarily as good. Because like I read another one that is an evil guest, which that I read this year and I thought it was okay. I mean, there's bits and pieces of it that are I think pretty good, but for the most part, not nearly as good as this one, but still worth reading. And this one definitely worth reading. The Wizard Knight, super kind of fun and strange chivalric fantasy, I guess, for lack of a better term. Um, but yeah, yeah, really good stuff. Totally worth checking out, especially if you like, you know, Gene Wolfe, and you ought to like Gene Wolfe because it's so good. All right, number four, we have another series, and this is Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. Um, another author who you should basically read everything from because all of the Ursula K. Le Guin stuff is really good. Um, Earthsea, kind of different than a number of her other things by being, you know, much more oriented at young readers in a kind of clever way that I think is it's basically, I think that Earthsea does a really good job of capturing that specific, very narrow point of being totally readable for younger readers, um, and also having a lot of kind of more sort of subtle things going on underneath the sort of main text in a way that is interesting if you're, because I'm not a younger reader anymore. I read The Wizard of Earthsea, the first one, in seventh grade, so I would have been like 12. But I hadn't read the whole series, and even though I only have the first and the third books covers up here, I have now read the whole series. I think the later books, probably fair to say, I did not think are quite as great. There's kind of a long time gap in terms of the writing of the books, between three and four. And I think four is fairly divisive to Hanu, because it is in many ways a very different flavor of story, especially after The Farthest Shore, which The Farthest Shore is this kind of huge adventure story that goes to all these different places and sees all these different crazy things. And then Tahanu is a very kind of much more kind of subtle and sedate. There's not this kind of huge adventure that the characters are going on. It's mostly kind of them hanging out at the farm, but is also really good in a different way, and is, I think, totally worth reading. Um, so it's, yeah, it's kind of an odd thing, but it is really, I mean, Earthsea is really cool. It's yeah, in some ways, I think it's too bad that Hogwarts has become sort of the standard for wizard schools, because I think the school on Roke in Earthsea is really interesting, and has all these kind of fun elements that are, on display in these books. And of course, they're just sort of wonderfully told fantasy stories. So, yeah, Earthsea series for this year. All right, the next one. This is the first reread that I have on my list. Wonders Will Never Cease by Robert Irwin. Robert Irwin wrote a number of kind of fiction stories many years ago, and then took a long break in between those and this one. Although I think he published some kind of nonfiction stuff, and there's a collection of medieval Arabic poetry, if I remember, that he translated and edited and all of that. So that's really cool. He, if I remember, has like a PhD in medieval Arabic literature or something, which is pretty neat. Wonders Will Never Cease is about the Wars of the Roses. It follows a character. Anthony Woodville is his name, and he is basically the real life version of the character who inspires Jaime Lannister in the Game of Thrones stories. His sister marries Edward. Elizabeth Woodville marries Edward the Fourth of England, and she's the mother of the princes in the Tower. And the story starts with Anthony experiencing this sort of Grail vision thing, and then in being involved in this sort of strange historical fantasy thing going on. And it's very much about kind of all of this Arthurian mythology, but also this kind of reflexive quality to storytelling and tales, and all of these stories that are told about Anthony Woodville that kind of take on a life of their own over the course of the book as a whole. And all of this kind of, yeah, it's just really kind of fascinating and wonderful, and super fun. I also read The Brothers York, which is what I read actually just before this one, which is a history of the Wars of the Roses, which was cool. It was cool to read that one and see kind of the sort of historical discussion of all these different characters, some of whom make larger appearances in the story, right? Like, Edward the Fourth is in there a lot, and George of Clarence, and Richard of Gloucester, who becomes Richard the Third. Anthony Woodville himself appears in that one a couple of times. But then there are also all of these kind of smaller characters who show up once or twice. I mean, Thomas Mallory shows up in The Brothers York once or twice, and he has a much larger part to play in Wonders Will Never Cease. There's great sequences where Anthony Woodville and Thomas Mallory are going around London getting drunk and telling King Arthur stories, and it's super fun and weird. Um, anyway, Wonders Will Never Cease. Really good stuff. A number, like I said, this one was a reread, so I knew that I really liked this book, but reading it again was great because I really like it. So, yeah, good stuff. All right. The next one on the list is The Map and the Territory by Mikhail Houellebecq. I hope that's close to pronunciation. Um, I am not an expert on his books by any means. I've read one or two others, I think. I've definitely read Platform, which is another of his, and maybe one other, I think, but I think that was a long time ago. Um, but this one won the Prix Goncourt, which is the basically the most prestigious French language literary prize. Um, and I've read a number of these Prix Goncourt books over the years, just because it seems like so many of them are really good. Even going way back, like I read Man's Fate by Andre Malraux a number of years ago, and it was just so good. And so it's like, oh well, clearly worth checking out. Some of these, there's some of them that I think I started the Kindly Ones at one point and was like, this seems good, but also really long, and so I'm not going to finish it now. Um, and then, like, Julien Gracq is one of my favorite authors, and he won for The Opposing Shore many years ago. And so, yeah, it's all. Anyway, seems like a good set of books, right? So, The Map and the Territory is a novel about visual art, among other things. I guess to say it's about visual art is kind of one of the core um, elements running through it. The main character, Jed Martin, is a an artist, and the map and the territory refers to his kind of first set of artworks are um, pictures, photographs of road maps of France, and then combined with photographs of the landscape itself. So it's the map and the territory. And then he takes a long break from creating art and then paints all of these paintings that become super special and incredibly highly valued and all that sort of stuff. And then he sort of goes into seclusion and makes his third um, kind of art period, living as a recluse basically, or semi recluse, on an estate with all the money he made from painting. And then in the midst of that, there's all of this other stuff that happens that is kind of fascinating and wild, including Hollebeck himself appears as a character in the book, who ends up having some kind of strange stuff happen to him in the story, which is fun and interesting, in a kind of weird and unsettling way. Again, it's kind of hard. A lot of these books, I guess I would say that I really like them as much based on all sorts of things that are very difficult to convey in a summary. And this one, in the same way, part of what's so interesting is the particular kind of texture of all of the different elements, and the flavor of the way the text is written as much as what actually happens in it. So, but anyway, this one, a lot of fun. It's one of those books that when I first finished it, I was like, oh, that was pretty good. And then I realized after like a couple weeks that I kept kind of coming back and thinking about things from this book, and that has, I think, elevated it after I first read it, of realizing just how much it has stuck with me over the course of several months now. So anyway, All right, we are getting closer and closer to the end. I guess this is number six. No, number seven. Orlando by Virginia Woolf. Um, I don't know. It's hard to say. Again, this is another one that is hard to say much about. Orlando is a sort of a kind of extended love letter to a real woman in Virginia Woolf's life. Is kind of one of the ways that it's often thought of. It's kind of an extended trip through literature in English from the time, kind of the Elizabethan era and the time of Shakespeare on. Orlando has this kind of unusual quality of um, living through life a little differently than most of the rest of us, um, including switching genders at one point and totally just taking on she, her pronouns and living that way. And so there's, I think, you know, a quality of that is really interesting to read, especially in a book from as early as this one is. It's also, I mean, reading Virginia Woolf is kind of sad because it's so good and it's, unable to read the words on the page through tears because it's sad that you're never going to write anything as beautiful as what is written there. And this one is no different because it's just like that. It's just constantly um, really, really incredible and a kind of masterful version of the craft of putting words on the page in English in a way that is kind of hard to come to terms with at times, but is really, really good. I mean, in this one in particular is just so good. And so, yeah, go read it if you haven't. All right, number 8 on the list is The Roving Shadows by Pascal Quignard. I hope that's how you say. I'm sure that's not how you say. Um, this is another one that won the Prix Goncourt. This is a reread because I had read this before. The first of the Quignard books that I read was The Hatred of Music many years ago, which I've reread a couple times since and is great. Um, this at the time was this is sort of nonfiction. It's kind of a strange blend of things. It's this kind of semi-aphoristic, or not even semi-aphoristic, collection of kind of stories and things that the titular Roving Shadows refers to the king of the domain of Saucion in the kind of late antiquity period, who Syagrius is defeated by Clovis of the Franks, and his kingdom is taken in, and that's the beginning of the Frankish kingdom, which becomes France. Um, Syagrius, after the battle, flees and ends up being um, captured and sent back to Clovis and put in a dungeon and eventually killed. And when Syagrius is being killed, he says in Latin, of course, "Where are the shadows?" And the book is sort of an attempt to explain what he meant by "Where are the shadows?" And is this kind of just unbelievable meditation on the nature of art and history and language and sort of what it means to care about um, literature and painting and visual and non-visual arts and all of this kind of collection of things that are talked about. And this is just sort of the first one of this series that Pascal has done, and they're all sort of fascinating and hard to grapple with. And this one perhaps the most so because it's the first one, and is just great and totally worth checking out. Yeah, I don't know how easy it is to get a hold of new copies of this because I think I checked and I don't remember about. Anyway, I don't know. hopefully you will be able to find a copy of this because this one is really good and is it's one of those books that reading the words doesn't necessarily take very long, but it will take a long time of kind of sitting and thinking and trying to wrestle with what it all means, much longer than it takes to get through all the words, basically. But that's cool, that's fun. And this one, I guess, is it's not really the opposite because it will also take a long time to think about, but it is the opposite in the sense that the words will take a long time for this one in a way that they don't necessarily so much for the Roving Shadows because the Roving Shadows is a lot shorter. But the Recognitions by William Gaddis is kind of immense and unfathomable. It is in this kind of strange place of I think one of the quotes on the back might be that Gaddis is perhaps the author who is most famous for not being famous enough, which is really funny and totally true because he kind of has this sort of cult quality of people who are interested in post-war American fiction and sort of wrestling with what all of this stuff means. The Recognitions, I think, famously, one of the things that a number of other famous, especially American post war authors, um, read at various times. And a little bit like John Hawkes in the sense of, it, especially the Cannibal, I think of as the one that seems like the comparison because it is also sort of at this um, almost like a last gasp of a particular flavor of modernism that gradually turns into postmodernism shortly after this kind of publishing period. Um, I don't know how much that holds up to scrutiny, but that's just sort of the way that I think of it. Um, Yeah, the book is really long, and I think is the longest book in terms of pages, and the longest total number of days I spent reading any given book this year. So that's fun. I think on my Kindle it was like 1,300 pages long. In print, it's a little bit shorter, but obviously that's just based on page and text size and stuff. So anyway, really good. Hard to say that much more about it. Gaddis has this kind of wonderful stylistic thing that he does where he's really interested in conveying kind of the sort of continual chatter that you might overhear, like walking down the street or sitting in a restaurant or being at a party or something. All of these kind of, disconnected single sentences or short phrases that are just kind of continually chattering in the background that is really interesting, and that is kind of this kind of uh, almost meaningless. I guess meaningless isn't right because as much as anything, the book is sort of about all of this chatter, but this kind of signal to noise thing going on of the noise of other conversation and the signal of the specific kind of particular characters that are really central to the story in here and all of this. Yeah. Um, anyway, the book is sort of about art and forgeries and fakeries, and I think one of the common things to say about it is that this is, a book about falsehood that is the real deal, basically, which I think is totally true. This is the real deal in terms of the art of putting English words on the page. Um, anyway, in the introduction, one of the other things I remember specifically in the introduction, William Gass says, "No great book is explicable, and so I shall not try to explain this one." And I guess I should have taken his advice and just said, "This is a really great book that is inexplicable, and go read it yourself." Anyway, and And last but not least, I want to talk about this series, which is Tom Swan. Tom Swan and the Head of St. George, and then and the Siege of Belgrade, and then and the Last of the Spartans, and finally and the Keys of St. Peter by Christian Cameron. I did another video talking about the first two books in this series, but since I've now finished it, I'm going to put it as the 10th of the favorites things on the favorites of 2024 list, because I really enjoyed this series. Um, this is really fun historical fiction. It's historical fiction in the sense of the setting, in the kind of sense of structure and pacing, all that. It's really, I'd say, much more kind of like a thriller. It's very fast paced and lots of crazy fun things happening. Um, Tom Swan is a young man who is captured at the very end of the Hundred Years' War and ends up being rescued and working for a Greek cardinal, and ends up going all over the Eastern Mediterranean. And then eventually in the fourth book, he comes back to England for a little while and spends some time in the modern Netherlands and all of that sort of stuff too. And then also, of course, comes back to Italy towards the end. And I think I said this in the video that I did on this series before, but he's basically kind of like James Bond in the sense that he spends most of his time doing spying things, and also um, there's willing to kill bad guys and also seducing beautiful women, and that's kind of his thing. um and it's great. It's the first three books, I guess, are or as the way that I read them as kind of completed collections, were originally published as serials. So each kind of section, each chapter basically, and there are, 6 or 7 chapters in each book, was published digitally separately and then combined together into a single collection that's sort of one arc of the story. Um, and that I thought worked really well for this particular series. Yeah, in this particular series, I think Christian Cameron does a really good job of balancing the kind of considerations of episodic storytelling, where you kind of both want a narrative arc to each episode, but also a narrative arc to each kind of larger collection. And so, you need exciting things to happen regularly, but you also need some downtime and all that sort of stuff. And I think this series is really good for that. I think unfortunately, I think the fourth one, Tom Swan and the Keys of St. Peter, is probably my least favorite of the books. It's the only one that wasn't written as a serial. It was all written as kind of one thing, even though it's kind of structured a little similarly, or at least it wasn't published as a serial. It might have been written in a more serialized structure, but it was all published as one thing, and it sort of still has that. I think there's 5 chapters in it, and they feel a little bit like that type of serialized structure in there. Um, Unfortunately, like I said, I think it was probably the weakest, but it's still I mean, it's a fun series, and I would definitely continue to read um, stories about the adventures of Tom Swan um, in kind of late medieval, early Renaissance um, Italy and other places. And yeah, really fun. Great action in particular. My understanding is that Christian Cameron is like a HEMA guy, and knows his stuff about sword fighting. And even if he doesn't know his stuff about sword fighting, it definitely feels like he knows his stuff about sword fighting. Because it's great. The action in here on display does a really good job of balancing the kind of technical side of sword fighting as a craft with the chaos of sword fighting as a moment of absolute terror where people are trying to kill other people. Um, anyway, so yeah, totally worth checking out these. Um, I don't know if there is a non-digital version of these. Unfortunately, I read them on the Kindle, um, so I guess that might limit the audience for these ones. Unfortunately, although there's lots of other Christian Cameron has published a bunch of things, so probably worth checking out some of the other stuff if you can't find these ones. Um, but yeah, that's gonna do it for my favorites of 2024. Yeah, like I said, there's definitely other stuff that could have gone on this list. A number of other things that I read that I really liked, and are totally worth talking about. And who knows, maybe I'll do something else with a couple of those if I get inspired. But otherwise, if you have read any of these, if you have opinions about them, anything like that, yeah, let me know. All of these books are books that I would totally talk more about, and would love to discuss in the comments or anything like that. And if you have any, if you have any recommendations based on the stuff in this video, let me know about that too, because I'm, always up for some recommendations of books to read. Um, anyway, so yeah, that is gonna be that for me for today. Um, yeah, I've been live from Palms Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.